All right, Signal Mountain Bible Church, it's my pleasure. Many of you have met my friend, Carlos Williams, pastor of Orchard Knob Missionary Baptist Church. He's been to our church on several occasions and spoken. Carlos and I met, I don't even know how many years ago it was. Carlos joined a preaching group that we had of pastors who were very like-minded. That group was really protected. We wanted to be theologically very similar so that we could just be open to sharing and praying together, and we would talk about issues. And so that was at least 5 or 6 years ago.
Oh, definitely, yeah. I would say 2015.
Okay.
Yeah, 2015, okay. I remember.
And I think you were one of the first newbies. Every year David would add newbies, but I think you were in the first group of newbies to that. And so what was interesting is from there was a group of pastors that I think we tried to get together, or you and David tried to get together probably 3.5 years ago, specifically to talk about racial issues. And those were very fruitful and helpful conversations for me. The interesting thing with that group is that it kind of boiled down to 4 of us. And and then recently we've been in a group on expository preaching, and what's funny is that it's those 4 with the addition of a couple more. And so so there's been a good history of that. And then also one of the things is, you've been so gracious in inviting Gary and I to participate in the Pastors Conference you've had here. Yeah. And that's been great. But above all of that, the reason I say all that is that my respect for you in who you are as a person, and then your stance on God's Word and your as I've seen you in your ministry just stand on truth and some of the things you've gone through over time, it's just endeared my heart towards you. You're one of the guys in town that I would trust with our pulpit, and so I'm thankful for you and your ministry. And so when the first thought came that we should do something like this, I mean, you were the person I thought of.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. So long history, and I do want our people to know that you and I have talked about these issues for years in some capacity, and so there's a comfort level, and that they may be uncomfortable with questions that I ask, but I think we have a comfort level. And one of the things at the outset that I also want to be clear of is that that I want us to. There's a ditch that I want us to stay out of, and 2. One is that I'm asking my friend to speak to some issues, but what I'm not asking my friend to do is to be the black representative for all black people everywhere. Yeah. So that what I don't want to happen is somebody to take something you or I said and said, this is what black people think, because that's not what we're doing.
Right, certainly.
What we're doing is trying to give some perspective and model conversation, and then to say, and hopefully maybe clear some pathways for us at Signal Mountain Bible Church, some of our folks, to do that. The other thing is that the other ditch that I want to stay out of is that in modeling some of this as pastors and friends is that, and I hope you know this, Carlos is not my black friend. He is my friend, and he is black, but there can be a danger in...
You do kind of resemble a little bit, though.
Yeah. But you know what I mean. There's a dynamic sometimes of, when we're trying to deal with racial issues, of that you've got a black friend, and I have several friends who are black, but what we all want to get to is that, and what I just want to bring out is that our friendship is based on a lot of different things. It just happens to be a dynamic
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
I
there.
agree. I agree.
And so, so when we do a video like this, I don't want it to. I don't want anybody to fall in either one of those two
I got you.
ditches.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to kind of talk through is, and there are a lot of terms that I don't like. You and I have talked before. We really don't even like the word. I want to talk about two terms that will be used that neither one of us are comfortable with. One is, I don't think either one of us are comfortable theologically with the words racial issues, because the cross has reconciled the races. However, we need language to use to talk about what's going on, and that just seems to be the easiest one. The other one is that we also hate the modifier, any modifier to church. Black church, white church, this church. The church is the church. However, I'm going to use those words in a little bit, because I do think when we're trying to talk through these issues, because of where we are, that those modifiers have to be used. And so that's on me, and I'm just gonna use those, but I just wanted to throw that out there at the very beginning, because I know where we stand, and we've talked through that as well. So I think the question that I would like to start with is, there are many people in the white church, I'll just start off with that, or in the, as I listen to podcasts or even hear folks talking in our congregation, would say something like this. There are a couple of different ways to ask this question, so I'm just going to wade into it and then we'll clarify.
Okay.
Is this like, hey, like racism in our history has been horrible, but man, we went through the civil rights movement in the 60s. So many things are better, Jim Crow laws, so why are we still here? That's a very white perspective.
Right.
And you and I have talked about that. And so I wanted to pitch that out as the first kind of question to have you address that.
Yeah, it's a good question, but let me first say thank you for including me to be a part of it. It's a joy, and whatever I can lend to help educate and enlighten, I'm glad to be of service. So let me thank you and for your friendship, genuine, authentic friendship across the years. Yeah. So great question. Let me start off by saying, I think in some ways, yes, we have come a long way. And I also want to say that no matter how I answer this question, there is still going to be a void or a gap in people outside of the African American race to understand, because they don't walk in our shoes. So there's certain things. So my answer is going to be, as detailed as it can. But I think there's going to be a void in the gap. So racism, in terms of people who have gone through the civil rights era, they don't see it as clear or conspicuous as it used to be, in terms of, hopefully you won't find in Chattanooga any black entrances to restaurants and white entrances, or water fountains or restrooms. We can sit anywhere we want on the bus, on the city bus if we were riding the city bus. Right. We don't have to move off of the sidewalk when a Caucasian woman walks down the sidewalk. So all those things were true in the civil rights era. But the reality now is that while the white hoods of Klansmen are not visible, the idea and the reality of what is alluded to as systemic racism exists. And so racism exists. We used to say systemically it exists and it's kind of concealed, but it's like, in my own perspective, in the past 3 or 4 years, even racism being kind of ingrained into the fabric of the major systems and institutions of our country, now it's like, okay, we kind of had it concealed, but now we just kind of want you all to know this is how we feel. And so when I say systemically, I'm talking about major systems in institutions such as education, the justice system, the health systems, hiring practices, acceptances into schools, universities, and even some seminaries, sad to say. And so racism does exist. It is still alive and well. We have progressed in the sense that maybe there are laws that have been changed that benefit the masses of African American people. But at the same time, we can say, are those laws enforced? Right? So in a policy way, they may have changed, but then there are yet some policies that have not been changed, that again makes for the advantage of certain races, and it becomes a disadvantage to others.
Yeah, and I want to be clear, because I know I like the way that you were talking about systemic racism, and there are landmines on all sides of these issues.
Yeah, certainly.
What you are not saying is that the system. So sometimes in philosophical terms, this may be going way too deep. The pushback is, no, systems aren't racist, people are racist. What you're saying is, oh no, I get that. However, there are things within the systems that make it way more difficult than it should be, and people within those systems that oversee that. Some of them knowingly, some of them unknowingly. There's some ignorance.
Yeah, I would agree.
There's some ignorance in that.
I would agree.
But what we're not saying is that we believe in personal responsibility and personal sin, and we're not going around that by talking about systemic racism. We're saying that the manager who has never hired a black man into a certain position, that just because he's never seen that modeled, that sin that may be known or even unknown in his heart is his sin. That he, ultimately before the Lord, he has to answer for that. On the flip side of that, the system that may, so let's say that the educational system is a huge issue, within our county, and that just because somebody is within a system that is not conducive to them getting the education that they need, does not eliminate, if they choose to then go out and create a pattern of living which is sinful, they still have to pay for their sin. But as ministers of the Lord, and as people who want to reconcile people, I don't understand anybody who wouldn't want to see true equal opportunity.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying.
Yeah. I am saying that some of the people that have made and controlled policy, I think in some cases know.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. How this is going to affect African Americans and other people that are marginalized, and I want to say African Americans, specifically for the times. Yeah. But I'll just go so far as to say as minorities as well.
Absolutely.
And then there are those who unknowingly, have policies that affect us. And I'll give an example of that. And this is a kind of a hard one, and I think me and you might have talked about it before. And that is being a pastor here in Chattanooga, and before coming here, I was pastoring in Flint, Michigan, and before then back home in Birmingham. And I have seen a trend in school systems where you had maybe a larger percentage, I wouldn't say it was the majority, but a larger percentage of African Americans, and a larger percentage of Caucasian school teachers. And based on these standardized tests, that are done, curriculums that are produced. Okay, if in fact a student is not meeting the standard based on the standard of that state or whatever the case may be, there is a tendency to put young black children in special needs classes at a higher rate than African Americans, and these are than Caucasians,
Right.
and there are tons, and the reason that I know this is because I've had school teachers in those areas, black school teachers, to say that they see this. Okay, and so there is in the minds of certain school teachers, not all. I love school teachers, and I think they do a great job, and I think they don't get paid enough.
Right.
But in their minds, they come to the table in some ways feeling that black children are inferior, and that there is some sort of flaw in their intellect, and they're the ones that are. Well, they call the parents in and say, "Hey, he needs to be put in this class." Okay, and that's the first alternative, rather than saying he's weak in this area, work with him in this area. Okay, maybe I need to spend more time, or even look at other alternative ways to instruct. Okay, versus just saying we're going to pull him out of the classroom, and he's gone 2 and 3 times a week out of the class, and you're stripping him or her of that opportunity, of that learning ability, where we know learning in groups, there is an effective strategy. So, that's just one of many ways, and we can go on and talk about what systemic racism looks like. But yeah, I agree. I think there are some people who know, but I think what has to happen is that people who control the policies and control these laws in whatever system I'm referring to, if they profess to say, "Hey, I'm not racist, I know that I'm not," then there has to be humility to listen to the people that are affected, to say, let me paint another perspective. Let me see if I can turn this coin so you can see another side of it, so that you can understand it, and hopefully you're like, "Oh wow, I didn't think about it like that."
Yeah, so I'm always troubled by, what I'm not troubled by is somebody doesn't know what they don't know, and there's a lot that I don't know.
Yeah.
What I am troubled by is that when I see emotional responses and emotional defensiveness to somebody who may be challenged, so for example, if you were to say to me, I'm just making this up, that there's, if you were to bring an issue up to me where you felt like that I was not seeing things correctly, or you wanted me to give your opinion, I think there's something going on inside of me that I need to question and trace back down to what's going on inside of me. If my gut reaction is I'll bring up another broad topic,
Okay.
and we won't go into that necessarily, but where I hear it a lot of times is that if somebody were to say to me, if you were to talk about white privilege, well, if I have a gut reaction to that, I want to say, well, Lewis, why do you have a gut reaction to that? Like, why does that bother you that Carlos would talk about white privilege? Why can't you then ask the question, Carlos, what do you mean by white privilege? What do you mean by that? And have a conversation. I think the gut reaction shows that there's some defensiveness there. Right. And so I think that's part of the reason why I even want to have these conversations, is because we're never going to learn from another perspective if I'm just constantly emoting if I'm just constantly emoting versus thinking. Like here's one of the things, and I think it has to do with, I do think you can, it has ties to a lot of things, but one of the things that really has been on my brain a lot during all of this, and this goes really back to the Ahmaud Arbery situation, and then recently, as of yesterday, there was a video released with police officers. Ahmaud Arbery, I know that wasn't police officer, but I'm coming to a point. This one, there were police officers, and they were. Right. There was a black man that was walking down the road, and somebody called in, said there was a black man walking down the road, and next thing you know, he's getting beat by, with 4 police officers. Anyways, horrible. I think one of the things that I've heard, and I think is one of the more convincing things in my mind, is this. When you talk about potential systemic racism, particularly in the judicial system, is that if you pay attention to the Ahmaud Arbery story, if there had not been a video, I mean, those men were not arrested.
Yeah.
When the video was released, then there was a move to arrest those men.
Certainly.
The way that, and we won't get all into each specific issue, but the way it sounds like, and I don't know what I don't know, but it sounds like the way that that things were going from a county level into the investigation of this man getting beaten on the side of the road, that it was heading a direction, and my assumption is that the video being released to the public, and the shame is, there's two, that it takes public outcry to move policy, because that demonstrates that there's something wrong with the implementation of policy.
So.
And the other is this, is that I think people don't understand, is that within the black community, there are stories of this sort of thing. It may not be a death,
Yeah, certainly.
but there are stories of these type of things happening,
Yeah.
and a real feeling as if justice is not served. And now all of a sudden, because videos are everywhere, it's like these aren't new. It just brings awareness to an issue.
Right.
Because one of the things I do want to ask, I want to bring out and have you speak to,
Sure.
because this is another, I think, false narrative that we get in the white community. As I've talked to you about various issues, you have never to me deified the victims of, and I'll just talk about police brutality for a minute.
Sure.
I've never heard you deify what I have heard you say, and other people that I respect, is no, this is bringing attention to a larger problem. And so nobody is saying that George Floyd was a perfect man.
Right.
So even going into his history is irrelevant.
Right.
We're just talking about, would justice, the system involved, and would justice have happened?
Right.
The white community, a lot of times I've heard, really want to jump to, he was, which is crazy to think about. He was trying to pass a counterfeit, whether he was or wasn't, is crazy.
Right.
Crazy. I mean, crazy. Nobody should be killed for that, right? Or apparently he had some run-in where he held a gun to a pregnant woman. Nobody's saying he was a saint, and nobody's trying to deify him. What's trying to be brought to attention to is the potential injustices in the system, and unfortunately, the feeling has been, and I think it's right, is that we've had to use these instances to try to shine a light on the system to say, hey, there's something wrong here.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like addressing the point that you just made about George Floyd and what people would say, okay, well, he's trying to pass a counterfeit 20 or whatever the case may be. My thought would be, and my first initial reaction when I hear people say that, because that's a card that has been played,
forever,
numerous times when we have those types of incidents, would be, I didn't think that a sinless life was the requirement for a person to live.
Absolutely.
And my thing is, we have no trust in several areas of the justice system, because, as you said, so the justice system was supposed to work prior. I mean, at the moment of the incident, like you take the Ahmaud Arbery case. So we run the risk, and I think where the outcry comes is that, okay, this should have been investigated. Okay, this should have come out sooner. the cover up, the possible, the guy getting off, the dad getting off because he was a retired police officer in the Ahmaud Arbery case. And then we fear with incidents like this is that when there is an indictment and the trial comes, will we get a fair trial with where some of these incidents take place? Then the jury selection is in the out county, in the suburbs, where greater pockets of Caucasians live. And then you have some of those individuals who are pro law enforcement and go into these trials and juries already with made up minds, and then there's no justice in that sense. And there's always these loopholes that we see as relates to police and their ability to use force, and what's excessive, what's not, did he resist arrest, and so it's just so many different aspects of the justice system that we feel is flawed. And so the only thing that we can do is just continue to cry louder, in a sense. And I think the other thing, Lewis, is also, I think there's much public outcry because this happens so much in cities and places that are not the larger cities, that didn't get filmed, that didn't get videoed. And sometimes we look at the Atlantas, the Minneapolises, the Detroit, the Chicagos, and if we look at just those major cities, they seem isolated and they seem so sporadic, when it's actually something that happens, even as we've seen just recently in mid-sized U.S. cities, in nice little, great towns like Chattanooga, where it's a great city and great place to raise a family. But they happen all the time, and that's the thing. I think that's why you see the protest as much as you see it, and why the outcry is a lot louder now. And you see, as a result of that George Floyd thing, it's like everything now is being examined, because in some ways, like we talked about earlier, the earlier question was, is racism, have we progressed? In some cases, no, I don't think we have, because now it's like, again, as I say, we're examining everything. Like, must we go into the state capitol and see Nathan Bedford Forrest and these Confederate monuments and flags and all these things? So it's like, even though these things have been there, it's like people are tired, people are frustrated, and especially now when we kind of see the fans, the flames of racism kind of being fanned now. Yeah.
So I just want to give you an opportunity to clarify one thing, because I know who you are, and then I want to come back and ask a question I haven't ever asked you, and you're going to be like, because this is a misconception, and I know you, so I just want to.
Sure, go ahead.
You love police officers.
I do.
You got police officers in your congregation?
I do.
You got family members that are police officers? You are not anti-police.
Nope, I'm not. Nope.
But there is a sense in which when we give, and I know one of the times when you and I talked, and too simplistic of an answer, right? But I said, I've got a solution for police brutality. We need to pay them more. And one of the things I was meaning by that is that we give, and we've got to, so this is not, we give police officers responsibilities and rights that we don't give anybody else.
True.
Like if somebody was coming and threatening my family or your family, and a police officer arrives on the scene and has to use lethal force, we give them the right to do that in the right situations.
Yeah, sure.
The difficult thing is that with that needs to come a high level of responsibility, whether it's training, whether it's misusing that power, whether it's having some kind of agenda or biases that would disqualify them from being able to hold that power.
Yeah.
So there's major issues there. But I wanted everybody to know, like, because I know you, that you're you're pro.
I'm definitely not
police.
I'm definitely not anti-police. My father is a retired police officer and has been, I mean, he was a police officer, I guess, 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
He's worked in county jail where I grew up, and he's worked as a city police officer.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess that's why I guess ended up becoming a preacher. I was scared to death, so I had to do something. Like my dad would kill me. No, I'm playing.
Now, one of the things I do want to ask, this is a question I've never asked you before. So, one of the things that's interesting about the reaction to all this, I don't even know how to ask this question because I didn't prepare to ask this question, so let me just say it and then you ask me, like, what in the world are you trying to say there, Lewis? Do you think that the reaction, do you think there's a sense in which, I mean, I know we would all agree there's a sense to which the reaction to some of these things has gone too far. If we're talking about easy things, like, the easy things would be like rioting, destruction of property. That's easy stuff to say, yeah, it's gone too far. I guess where I'm asking if you think it's gone too far is that, so maybe my thing would be is that, I look at history as pendulums swinging. And I'm not saying I know where the pendulum is ending up here. That's not what I'm trying to say. But it's this. Let me just make up a situation. Let's say that because of all this stuff has taken place, that what we do is that we just replace all of city council, all the mayor's office, everybody that works there, any white person, we just take them out and we just put all black people in there, right? I know what I'm saying is that the problem with that, or the only problem with that in my mind, is that instead of having conversations and really working on issues, sometimes if we're just emotionally reacting to things, and I want to use, and I don't know what really happened in this NASCAR thing. I don't know if you've kept up with. For those of you who don't know, there's one black driver in NASCAR. As this happened, he really pushed, and NASCAR said, and I'm not a NASCAR fan, so I don't know exactly what I'm talking about, but evidently the rebel flag is flown at NASCAR events, and so they were going to ban it. Well, or they did ban it from inside, but then, like, somebody flew a plane over with a rebel flag that said something. There was some awful comment, and then
that was in my home state in Talladega.
Yeah,
I mean, in Alabama, by the way.
And then the other thing is that and we now don't know whether it was a noose or whether it was, but was fat. So, I was using that example to say, what's interesting is that now all of a sudden, because of these events, everybody's hopping on board at some levels. And I think what I hope is happening is that people are having conversations in being more inquisitive than just saying, oh, because Carlos is black, I'm going to accept anything that he says because that's what I'm supposed to do in this cultural moment. I don't think that advances. I don't think that advances us anywhere, especially with inside the church.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
What are you really trying to say, Lewis?
You know what I mean by that?
I think I'm following you.
Yeah. So I do see a danger in, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, is I do see a danger in saying, "Hey, I'm going to have a conversation with Carlos, and because he's black, he's the authority on everything." And instead of us saying, "No, the true thing that needs to happen here is relationship and talking, so that I can gain perspective."
Yeah.
Because together,
I'll follow
you. We move versus just a simple.
Well, I mean, I think what we see, just to address the protest, but before I do that, I think multiple things need to come out of all of this.
Yeah.
You talked about establishing relationships. You're talking about sitting down with people to talk about policy, so forth and so on. I think the reason that we see the intensity now, I think, because the George Floyd incident is one more incident.
Yeah.
And just from my own personal experience, and also from, just talking to people in my congregation and just people outside my congregation about what they really felt in this George Floyd incident. I think it's how he died, that really kind of angered a lot of people. And I think from that, it really brought out, you can't, let me see if I can put it like this. You know how, and I hope this is not offensive to anybody who's watching. You know how you may have people who have been, it's been said that people who have experienced sexual harassment are afraid to come out, right? Because of what the backlash is going to be, the attention, the spotlight. But when someone does come out publicly, that it empowers the people that are quiet and like, okay, I've got a platform now. I need to, if that person can be bold to tell their story. I think it's in a sense similar to where the reason the protests are as intense is because there are pockets of African American communities who have been treated like George Floyd, with the exception of dying, to where police and others profile them, kind of attack them, and the story is never told. So it's like we see in those pockets, communities like that, young African American males saying, "Yep, I know exactly what they're talking about." And so you see this popping up, you see this popping up. I think people like here in Chattanooga and places like that, because we may not see it at a higher rate, we kind of turn our heads, we kind of turn our eyes from it and say, well, that didn't happen in our community. No, it does happen in our community, maybe not at a higher rate. And so the protests continued over and over and over and over again, and to my knowledge is still going on today, because people are like, I need to tell my story, and we just cannot, we don't know what it's like in those larger inner cities, to where those policemen, and not all policemen, but what that experience is like for some of those African American boys. The other thing I wanted to say also, as relates to policemen, things of that nature, I think there is an issue that we have, and especially areas like this, where our departments, whether on the city level, the county level, don't really reflect the community that they serve. There is a big gap, okay, and I want to be very honest. When I say, if you take a city like Chattanooga, or take Hamilton County, the largest pocket of African Americans are in Chattanooga, right, in our county. And when you hire individuals who are not necessarily from Chattanooga, that live in the out county, that don't have relationships with African American community, then that poses a problem in how you react or how you see African Americans and the threat that you automatically think that they bring to you. I think that's a big issue and a big problem with hiring practices. I know even in this county, there are instances, things that the African American community, pastors and others have fought with the sheriff, where there have been issues where some of the sheriffs that have been accused of profiling and their mistreatment of African Americans have been fired from other departments, okay, let go from other departments in other areas, whether predominantly white areas, and have been hired in the county. And those things, those are problems, and those are some of the things that we encounter. But again, back to your point, I think multiple things need to come out of this. I think, yes, policy. I think, yes, ridding some people out of office. Yes, I think getting the body of Christ and others establishing relationships, doing the types of things that we're doing today. I think multiple things need to come out of this, and not just one. No, we don't. I don't condone the violence, the riots, but I do want to say, it's been said that that protest or it may even be said that even riots is the language of the unheard.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and while I don't agree, it's like when it gets to this extent, can you hear us? You know, and so as a pastor and as a preacher of the gospel and a follower of the Lord Jesus Christ, of course, the violence, the riots, the destruction of property, in no way do I condone. But in one sense, it's like when you keep a person down and you keep a person chained, when you keep a person suppressed and oppressed, don't be surprised of the response. And all I'm saying is that people who watch this video and others who are not from Chattanooga, who don't see it like it is actually happening in inner cities, try to understand what that would be like if that was you. If you saw the oppression, not just the police brutality, but I'm talking about those other systems that we talked about, such as, you know, health disparities, education, job opportunities, so forth and so on. Those things continue to add up. I was a person where it was taught in my house. My dad is a retired pastor as well. He's a man of all trades.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
he's done everything.
Yeah, my dad's a retired pastor, and my mother played piano, so we were raised in a Christian home to love everybody, to treat our fellow man right, to be just and right. And I was raised like that, and I've continued to do that all my life. But I was also a young man who went to school with a humility. And I used to get picked on by some other my black brothers who saw me as passive and, oh yeah, we can get by with Carlos, we can take his lunch money. And I was that person that they just mess with me. And then one day, when they messed with me for the last time, I exploded and I got into a fight and I beat them up pretty bad and I won that fight. So I get it. And I think people just need to understand, like, everybody has a boiling point. Everybody has an explosion point. And that explosion point may not necessarily come out the right way, but I think we can't be too critical of people who are in those situations. And if we don't know what it's like to be in those situations, it's very easy to criticize.
Yeah, I think I've heard it well put, and you're saying the same thing, that you, in no way would you ever say it's okay or it's right, and it's anti to what's been trying. All of that, you agree with that. I think what you're bringing out is what I've heard said of, but you understand where the anger comes from.
I do.
You understand what motivates it versus saying it's okay.
Because
it's not okay.
Because I was one of those, and I'm just being very candid and frank, I was one of those who, upon seeing that video for the first time, the George Floyd incident, I was ready to throw something. I was ready to tear up something. Okay, but it's the Holy Spirit living in me. Thank God for the filling of the Holy Spirit. And at that moment, I have to step back and pray and restrain, and really pray, you know, for the Spirit's leading in that moment. And then I'm kind of pulled back in. And I think maybe that's the difference between those who have the Holy Spirit and those who don't.
Which is where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
Which is where I wanted to go, because I agree wholeheartedly that it's wise to look at worldly institutions or all of that and say, hey, you know, because, you know, we're commanded as Christians to, you know, the foundation of what we believe is that man is created in the image of God. And then as we go all throughout the scriptures, you know, over and over in the Pentateuch, we're told to look out. The people of God were told to. Israel was told to look out for the marginalized, the oppressed among you, the widows, the orphans, the aliens, the oppressed. To look out.
Yeah.
In Isaiah, one of the reasons that Israel was disciplined by God is because they didn't do that. Over and over again, that's a theme in the book of Isaiah.
Yeah.
Then we get to the New Testament. And Jesus quotes Isaiah in Luke 4, and we remember this passage, but sometimes we don't really listen to the end of this. So this is when Jesus was in the temple, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favor of the year of the Lord." What's interesting is that a lot of times we just latch on to the miraculous part of healing the blind and preach the gospel and good news. And Jesus could have cut his quote of Isaiah short. He did that in other situations. You know, when John the Baptist asked, "Are you the one?" He cut off the quotation where it says, "And the captives will be free."
Yeah.
Because he knew that John was not going to be set free. So as Christians, man, we've got to take this seriously. People are created in the image of God, and New Testament, we are all one. The book of Galatians, I mean, just is rich in this theology of oneness beneath the cross. That doesn't mean I don't like. I had a friend in high school who really educated me on. In high school, I used to say I'm colorblind, and he just real gently said to me, "Number one, no, you're not. You know. Number two, really, that's not what we're asking. You know, if we want to celebrate culture, we want to celebrate differences in culture, and we don't want to be blind to culture. We want to look at point. But as a Christian, and as the Christian church globally, what I've been really convicted of, and said this Sunday from the pulpit, is that the danger of us not having these conversations is that within the Christian church, we can further divide. This is where I'm going to use the terms I don't like, you know. So in other words, we would all love, I think, to see a day to where congregants at Orchard Knob Baptist Church, congregants at Signal Mountain Bible Church, see each other as one, celebrate differences, walk together, so that an issue that affects my brother Carlos, as we have conversations, and I see that as an injustice, we stand together against injustice, or an issue, you know, the opposite way. Yeah. The danger right now is if these conversations don't happen, certainly, is that we further divide. And in some of the early conversations you and I had years ago on race issues, was really seeing the disconnect between white congregations and black congregations, and I was blown away, just frankly listening to you, and then I was really blown away by coming to realize how some people in the black congregation felt. And it really softened my heart towards that. So can you speak to how should the church, because I do think our response as a church should lead the way to like we should be agents of change. The world should look at us, 1 Peter 3:15, and say, man, how are y'all able to do that when we can't do that? Yeah. The shame would be is as this thing shakes out that there's just no difference. So can you speak to, from your perspective, what the difference of the church should be in its response? Since and when I say the church, I mean we see the church in the same way. We've had those conversations, and the gospel is the gospel. I don't have to lay that out because you embrace the same gospel that I embrace. How do you think it should be different in the church?
So you're saying pretty much the response of the church to the issues? You know, let me backtrack for a moment, and we talked about racial reconciliation.
Yeah.
You know, let me just use, for example, this church. I think there have been attempts by the predominantly African-American church and the predominantly white church to make these steps in using their language of racial reconciliation. But their idea, and I say their idea, I'm talking about both churches. Mm-hmm. The idea of racial reconciliation was just to be, like, I know that this church used to fellowship with Brainerd Hills Baptist every year. Mm-hmm. Brainerd Baptist would come here, pastor would preach, Orchard Knob would go there, he would go preach their choir, and then they did this thing where both choirs met, rehearsed, and came together. But the problem is that was the extent.
It felt good.
Felt great. And both groups, I think, walked away feeling like, you know, we met our quota for the year. you know, and that's the justification of the use of terms when people say, "Oh, I'm not prejudiced," because we fellowship with Orchard Knob. I mean, we fellowship with Brainerd Hills. You know, that fellowship ended, and from what I understand, this happened prior to me coming here and assuming the pastorate here. That fellowship ended. It was ended by the Brainerd Hills Church because some of the members of, this is how it was brought to me, some of the members of Brainerd Hills were uncomfortable when the pastor here preached, and he preached culturally in his style.
No, okay.
Yeah, and so that was weird for them, and so that's how I understand that it ended. But I use that as an example to say that I think that there is a distrust talking to people in the African American church, a distrust, you know, for, and just being frank, not all, but I think the black church looks at some white churches as being hypocritical because they say, okay, we can fellowship and do a fellowship day once a year, but what about when we're experiencing issues like this? We don't get a chance to see you all visible, okay? You may preach it to your people, but we happen to believe and think that there are other ways it can be addressed. I preached, and I think me and you talked about that James passage that talks about faith without works is dead. And when James says in chapter 1, I think verse 26, 27, when he says pure religion before God and the Father undefiled is this, and he talks about visit the orphan and the widows and so forth and so on. And you know, just kind of doing the word studies on that, you know, people who are deficient, marginalized, the afflicted, okay, and it says widows, orphans in their affliction, right? And so an application would be their affliction of the marginalized come in many forms. And we believe that, or I happen to believe that the faith without works, when you get into chapter 2, means it really boils down to love, right? And love has to be visible in what is the church doing to actually meet the needs of the marginalized, right? So that does not necessarily mean that it looks like that you're protesting with us, but then at the other side we would say, well, why not? Okay, because when you look at the civil rights movement, we saw pockets and pockets of whites, even in the Christian church, Catholics, Jews, so forth and so on, that were present. And we feel like that made a difference. And I think it makes a difference because if we're trying to change a policy, or we're trying to change a law that's going to really advance the marginalized, then think about the impact and the strategy of what it's like for, let's say, a white politician who knows that he or she can keep a policy the way that it is because he or she knows that they will have no backlash from their own constituents, right? But what would that look like if you have a group of African American pastors and the predominantly black church that say, we won't change because this is what's happening to our people, and then you have white churches to stand and say, this needs to happen, blah, blah, blah. That begins to at least impact or change the dynamics, right? And so that for me is faith without works is dead. If it's just being preached in the confines of your own sanctuary, which preaching is powerful, preach the gospel, that is going to transform. I totally stand on that. But then what about the tangible actions that come? What good is it if someone comes to me hungry and I tell them to go and be filled, but I do not provide, right? Well, and so
when you even said it more powerful to me last time we talked.
Okay, I don't know if what I said.
And that one of the things that you pointed out in that was, and I think this is a linchpin issue here. Like, this is so vitally important, is that passage talks about visiting.
It does.
Gives this connotation of, so what we wouldn't say is, hey, it's our job as a congregation to take care of the widow and orphan, and the way we're going to do that is that if they come to us for help, we'll help. No, the thrust of that passage is, is to go.
Right, that infinitive of to visit.
Yes.
The strength of it being seek out.
Yes. So
is that what
yes,
you're saying?
that's exactly what I'm
okay.
saying. Because the danger in leaving that piece of it out is this, is that there are several things over the years that I have learned about, things that you've had some inside knowledge on, some things that I'm like, oh, I didn't know that, and that you may have gone and met with the mayor or police chief or somebody, and on the back end of that, I've been like, man, I could support you, but it's going to take relationship.
It's going to take relationship, and that's the thing. The thing is, I think in those moments, and kind of back to your point, do I think, I think there are a lot of my brothers in the white church. Again, we hate using those qualifiers. Who I love and trust, believe in, that they're authentic relationships. They love the Lord, and I'm bold about telling everybody in the circles that I have met great friends, and we're just close. But I think in those moments, we're looking for more.
Yeah.
Like, I don't just need someone to just call and say, hey, and I'm not saying that I don't appreciate that. Hey, man, how are you feeling? What's going on? You okay? I'm praying for you. And if that's the extent, that's in my book, not enough. If after you and I have established relationships, and you see me downtown protesting this, or being vocal about this, I think I'm not saying that because you see me down there, you need to come. But I do think, however, that your relationship with me, you will seek out to understand what's going on. And after hearing me lay it out, I think because we have a relationship, your trust for me, then I think compels you to act, or even ask the question, what do you need me to do? What needs to happen? And I think that's the thing. That I think it has to be in the impact that the church can have, unified, black and white, is relationships outside of just having a yearly fellowship and just saying that you preached in my pulpit, I preached in yours. Because what affects one affects all, and that's the thing where we don't get an opportunity. I think some white ministers, like I know some who only want to do the let's go down and let's pray. Powerful. I love prayer. I think it's powerful. But I'm just still suggesting that there is more.
And there's also, I want to bring this up as well, because one of the other issues that you and I are just step on is that we're not interested in photo opportunities.
I'm not. I hate them.
Yeah. And you've avoided that, and that's another false. I don't even know what false relationship is. That if you and I are only talking when the cameras are on, that's not a real relationship. That's not a real digging in. On the backside of that is because the issue becomes, because I know you, because I know your heart, because I know your stand on the gospel, on God's word. I mean, theological issues, we've talked about tons of those, that if I were to see you going to do something, I would stop and ask you, because I trust you.
Right.
Hey, what's going on here? To where, and I hate to be this way, but there are other folks within our, black and white, that I wouldn't stop and ask, because theologically or other issues there. One of the things that was really interesting to me is, and you have modeled for me, and I'm thankful for this, is, you brought several of your friends, white pastors, in for the pastors' conference here. And that was based on, I think, in fact, you've told me this, but that was based on competency. But there was some intentionality, saying, "Hey, I know this is going to be uncomfortable for my congregation. I know." And there was, what was really interesting about that was, I remember we met at a hotel the first time that we met at a hotel over in East Brainerd, just to have a. And what was interesting was, and it was less. I think it really was less about skin color and more about some of the guys you brought in to teach, that you knew from Michigan or other things, had been together before.
Right.
And one of the things that I realized was there was a tendency to kind of pull up a little bit.
Yeah.
And it was interesting as I walked in the room, felt, and we got to go away from, how's he going to handle it? Not from you,
Right.
but from some of the other black ministers there. There was a little bit, from a couple, there was a little bit of, how's he going to handle this? What was great was, as the weekend kind of went on, there was just real good, genuine fellowship. And even in what blows my mind is, even in 3 or 4 hours together, if we just put ourselves in uncomfortable situations, man, some fruit can be born for the church.
Oh, yeah.
For the church.
Definitely.
And I'll tell you this, I mean, one of the gifts from that is that my world was opened up to some men of God that have blessed my life because I listen to them or read some of their stuff that it wouldn't have been opened up to.
Yeah.
And so you have modeled that. However, we've got to continue marching forward. And what's a little bit frustrating for me personally, just to be real honest with you, is it's easier for you and I to be close and to model for our congregations. What's a little tougher is, how do we bridge those other gaps where it's not artificial, but it's legitimate? Because what I do see is, I do really think, like, if I were to poll your church and poll my church and just talk about relationship, I do think, from what I've heard you talk about your congregation and knowing my congregation, there would be a desire for real friendships. But I think that's the word you hit on, because our church used to be in a relationship, probably born out of the same movement from the same group with good intentions.
Right.
But the reason that it fell short was because if we can somehow promote that, I just think it does so much better for this.
Yeah, it's got to be organic.
Yeah.
It can't be just necessarily around issues,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I'm not saying issues should bring us together,
Right.
but once together, issues shouldn't keep us together. Shouldn't have to keep us together.
That's right.
It has to be organic, and if it's, and again, it's a safe space because there's already, a security in the fact that, okay, believers are getting together with believers. Okay?
That's it.
So it's already a safe space.
Should
right?
be.
And it should be. But again, I would challenge the churches. My church, how many relationships have you established? Which really is our mission and goal is to disciple the world, right? And establish relationships with people that are outside, that are not in the ark of safety, right? They're not in the body of Christ. So how many relationships do you have outside? And I'm just talking to people in my congregation. They would say, like when the George Floyd incident happened, we were talking about it in our Sunday school class, via Zoom, and they said, I'm amazed, because a lot of my coworkers that are white, were calling to check on me, and we really, really love that. But we challenged them because some of them were like, you're my closest friend, I love you, blah, 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 blah. And they said, and they felt that relationship was authentic. But then when they think about it, it's like, they've never been over to my house.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been over to hers.
Mm-hmm.
So that relationship is as good as work. And if I'm some TVA exec and I have, and I'm some black TVA exec and I have a white friend that's a TVA exec, right? You're friends with a certain kind of black person. See what I'm saying? With a professional black person who has some education, so forth and so on. But then there needs to be an internal look of how do you see that black person who's not a TV exec, who doesn't have formal education. You know, is there a stereotype there? And so those are the questions and things that we've talked about, and it was amazing. And it's true to your point that these types of conversations can make a major difference. One young lady who's a member of our church, she's an attorney, and she works for Unum. And after the George Floyd thing, which of course this George Floyd thing has just opened up a whole lot of stuff, they end up having a big company call with all the high-level execs and so forth and so on. And I think the lead executive was like, this call is strictly for us to have open conversation and dialogue. And they kind of let one of the they let the girl who's an attorney, a member of my church, talk about her experience and what that's like, and how she feels. She was giving examples of systemic racism, and she talked about, I can list, she cited some examples of jobs that were given to her white counterparts. She talked about jobs and assignments that were kept from her, jobs and assignments of people who did not have a law degree and she had a law degree, so forth. And on that call, a white executive confessed, based on her experience, she said, wow, based on your experience, I could be a racist. And so it was like those revealing types of things, again, shedding light on those situations. In her mind, she had not been, but to see that and to hear some of the experiences and say, how many people are in high level, leadership. And so I think the same thing for the church. So I think, because born out of, we wanted born out of our conversations when all of us were getting together and we were talking about race, the next step was supposed to be somehow having platforms with our congregations to come together to discuss some of these issues. And the hope was that individual relationships were born out of that. And I think those would be powerful. But again, it's like it's a safe space because we are who we are in Christ, right? And we have an expectation of each other, that humility, that characteristic of humility and love and understanding and patience and being forbearing and forgiving, all those things are going to be assumptions, right? They should be assumptions. But again, like outside of that, is that going to be the key? The key is going to be relationships that we establish outside of people who are not in the body of Christ, who, and again, I'll go so far as to say the types of congregations will matter, okay? Because there's an assumption that black people have of Signal Mountain. Yep. And then there's an assumption that Signal Mountain may have of a church like Orchard Knob, who has a big group of professionals, so forth and so on. So it's even the type of church. But what about that other church that doesn't have the professionals, so forth and so on? Would Signal Mountain, or would that church, and it happens in the black church too. So it's not something.
Well, and I want to point out something, because I want to be real frank about this. I remember sitting around the table. You were out of town, because you were faithful to those meetings when we were trying to have those conversations. But I remembered sitting around the table. It was me, Gary, David, and Gerald.
Wow.
And I remember feeling like the only one missing was Carlos. And then I remember reflecting a little bit later on, man, at times in these conversations there were a lot more people. And there's a scattering because it's not easy. Right? I mean, it's not easy. Like, there are legitimate, you and I have some, what I would consider some, there's some disagreements that we may have. And we, what I've loved about the relationship is we can talk about those, even, 3 or 4 weeks ago, with David involved. And what I loved about it was, as we ended, David was like, "Did I upset you?" And you're like, "No, we're because of relationship, we can have these hard issues
right.
or hard conversations." And so I agree 1,000%. And because within the church, what binds us together is the gospel.
Yeah.
What binds us together is God's word. And as we're standing on God's word together, moving forward, and one of my big, I won't go there today, but yes, that's what binds us together and kind of moves us forward.
I just think one of the reasons, I think the whole motive behind us getting together was pure, and I think the guys that I was able to reach out to bring into that fellowship, their motive was pure, it was authentic.
Absolutely.
I think and again, I think my presence ongoing has been because of, again, relationships that have been established. Those guys did not have the prior relationships. I think there are one or two, like Eddie Jackson, others, who you have relationships with, and those relationships continue to grow just like our relationship.
Oh, yes,
but
yes,
I think
yes.
I think the other reason why that fellowship kind of fell off is because, I don't think it's anything towards you or you guys. I think it's more so we're going to meet 6, 7, 8 times. We're going to talk about the issues, and that's pretty much going to be it.
Yeah, and I think that was probably both sides.
Yeah, and I think because I don't know if we really knew where to go.
No, we were floundering.
Yeah, I don't know if we really knew where to go. So I think the gesture was good, and I think that has helped, and I just think the Lord providentially is still working through all of that, but and has worked through all of it. But I think that attitude is the attitude of most churches. They're like, so yeah, I think my church will be willing to have fellowships with another church and so forth and go on. But we don't need to do it under the name of racial reconciliation just because we're having a church service, right? Conversations, candid, hard conversations, even to the point where, I've seen like times with, even in marriage, we talk through hard stuff and tempers may fly for a minute, but I think all of that's a part of the process.
I agree.
I think all of that's a part of the process. And I think, again, as Christians, hopefully we're able to recover from that moment. Just like you gave the example with David, that those were hard truths, hard things we were talking about. I think we were talking about the Colin Kaepernick thing. Right. And when we worked through that whole dynamic, and he saw this, and I had this perspective. Yep. That was uncomfortable. My emotions were bubbling. I wasn't angry, but my emotions were bubbling. But all I'm saying is that even after that, because of who I'm in Christ, who David is in Christ, who you are in Christ, and then I have a genuine love for David, then I know that even when I was talking about those hard conversations, I knew his heart. Yeah, I knew his heart.
So you maybe answered, and for the sake of time, I'm gonna summarize something that I think you just answered that was, I think is really helpful, and that is that that as a white church, where we have probably let down the black church is, and that probably goes both ways, is some of the barriers to relationships, number one, and then number two, I think something that you just said is really, I'm going to have to chew on this because I really like it, and that is maybe instead of us rallying around racial reconciliation as a church, us rallying around justice.
Yeah.
Because even putting it in that framework, what it means is that we would have to have a conversation about, let's take race out of it for a minute. If we were going to talk about justice with a certain thing and we take race out of it, we're going to have to have conversation and go to the Bible and dig and talk and talk. And I think that's probably a much healthier conversation.
I agree.
And it probably takes down some of the walls that the world, that I feel like needs to tear down, One of the things I've been convicted of is that I don't need to look at Carlos or Eddie as black pastors. No, you're a pastor. Because me putting that on that, number one, may, no pun intended, may color the way that I look at you, but it also may, I know friends that have allowed their black pastor friends to get away with things theologically for sake of not wanting to offend, and that's horrible.
Yeah,
that's you know what I mean. Versus, I hope you would call me out if you listen to a sermon and you're like, oh man, he's handling that passage wrong.
Yeah,
I don't care if he's white or black. I'm calling him and saying you're handling that passage wrong. So rallying around justice at this moment is an important thing, and so I guess that maybe also answers the question. Several folks in our congregation have asked me, what can we do? And I think maybe how we've summarized that is we've got to work on relationships, we've got to work on listening, and then we've got to work on applying the biblical text to these larger issues and saying white, black, Hispanic, whatever, when we see injustice as a church, we should be standing up against injustice, whatever form it takes.
I agree, and that's a great question. And so what I would say would be, of course, preaching those hard truths and hard passages that address race, that address injustice. And when making those applications, I know just using an expository method, we believe in the one thing that passage is saying, but it can be applied. The applications can be many, but when making those applications, make those applications so that people can really understand, that experience, And so preaching, I would also say, of course, the congregations being able to have those hard conversations together. I would also say what we're doing now, and that is having these moments of education and enlightening times. But then I also say going so far as to doing those things, they can be small or great. I just saw just the other day, you probably saw it on the news, there was a letter that was penned to the city council about having them not to vote on the current budget that they voted on the other day because it did not include police reform. And that I got sent a copy of that letter. I did not get my name affixed to it because they sent it and they wanted everybody to respond by the email by a certain time. But it was a letter to the city council, and they wanted all these pastors, and so there were white and black pastors that affixed their name to that. That's an example of a small thing to do that did not compromise theology. Okay, because it was really in that letter at that time there was really no. There was no text that they used, as the foundation of the letter. It was just speaking to, hey, we need reform. Please do not vote on the budget as it is in its current form. Allow the citizens to come and to voice their concerns, so forth and so on. So fixing your name to things like that. And then asking yourself, and I guess we can go on, but asking yourself, what can I do publicly, visibly in affecting change for the marginalized without compromising your theological beliefs, and really asking yourself in honesty, like, what can I do? How far can I go? And that may look like, Lewis, that may look like joining a march, but it may look like a protest. I'm not, and again, I'm not giving, just to say these are the only options. But yeah, please know that if you do join a march or you do join a protest, like I have gone down to be a part of the protest downtown Chattanooga, with and marching alongside people of color who don't share my theological beliefs. But I was down there. I knew I was down there. I was down there for the issue of justice, right? But I also knew that if a certain method or approach or protest happened, then that's where I separate. So I feel like as a black man who's also a preacher who pastors a predominantly African American church, I had an obligation to be there because it was, again, giving voice for the voiceless and giving voice to an issue that is a prevalent issue in our society. And I don't think my presence there compromised in any way, my Christianity. I don't think that I was sacrificing my theological beliefs and my biblical views at all. And so I think John MacArthur, I saw a video that he had put out a while back, and I think he was responding to a question about social justice or racism, things of that nature. And he made a great point about that we don't need to use terms to qualify the term justice. The term justice biblically is just justice, right? But in that word standing for justice, you cannot ignore that racism is a factor. And if the church, whether it's the white church or the black church, is going to address the issue of justice, they have to address the issue of racism.
Right.
In that. So I would say, yeah, education. I would say congregations having the hard conversations together. I would say the preaching those hard truths during those times, because, hey, man, during those moments before this George Floyd incident and other incidents that have happened, I've had to break sermon series to address it because I know that Sunday I was going to have a group of hurting people. I also know that I needed to make sure that I go in ahead of what their possible response and reactions could be to these issues. So I needed to, as the pastor and the shepherd, guide my sheep into say, be angry, sin not. And and go in and say, be mad about the things that God is mad about, but make sure that you don't do A, B, C, D. Okay?
Yeah, and I like to equate this to marriage as well. You referenced that a minute ago, but if I were to go home today and my wife were upset about something, and let's say she was deeply moved to tears or to anger, the proper response from me should be to listen to her, to love on her, to care for her.
And then ask, what can I do?
Ask, what can I do?
To help, yeah.
And does that mean that at some point that I may not challenge a perspective or how she... No, that's going to happen, but if we've got a relationship, that can happen tomorrow, the next day, whatever. I think one of the things that I want our people to hear, and one of the things that's touched me deeply, is that you've said many times today, and I've seen it in you, I've seen it in other folks that I've sat down and talked to, many conversations over the past couple of weeks of this isn't this is a real hurt, a real pain, there's real tension, there's real heartache, and the last thing that needs to happen is to lead with, here's how you should feel. We wouldn't do that to our spouse. And so what I love about what you're saying is, and what the thing that the Holy Spirit does, I think, is that when we sit down and I listen, all of a sudden your pain becomes my pain, and all of a sudden I start, not to the same degree, right? But that I start to say, oh, I've never thought about that. I've never thought about, I can say at times in my life where I feel like I've been unfairly treated, how that makes me feel. But what I've never, one of the first conversations, light bulbs that went off, and I'll mention this, and then I know we've gone way too long, but okay. This is that we were talking in one of those meetings, and you talked about how when you had been pulled over, what that experience was like, and that even here you all teach your youth how to handle getting pulled over by the police. Yeah. And one of the things that I mentioned to you was, I remember being a college student, a police officer was following me, and the first thing he said to me, he's like, "Well, you were driving a little erratic there. Are you nervous about something?" And I just started smarting off to him. "Yeah, I'm nervous. You've been following me, and blah 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 blah." And this is rural Blount County, middle of nowhere, and I was just giving the cop lip. And the reason that I was sharing that story is just the difference in even the feeling when the blue lights come on.
Yeah.
You know, and that officer was great and fine or whatever, right, to me.
Right.
But I am foolish if I take my experience and project that on to some of the things that you've shared with me, you know, and some of those things. And so these relationships are important. They're vital. Conversations are important. We can't let them go on. But the thing that has to happen is relationships need to be formed. Real conversations need to happen. And we also, I want to go back to, and I'll end with this, is that we also have to, when we feel as a white person, when I feel the need to defend and to justify a position, I have to ask myself, what's going on inside of you that makes you not just be able to listen to your friend Carlos in this matter? It doesn't mean that I have to agree with everything that Carlos says, but it does mean that I've got to say, man, is there something within you that is being defensive here? And if it's just defensive for the sake of being defensive or whatever, true friendship means you're able to kind of swallow that, listen, and continue in.
Yeah, and just to respond to that, and that is, I agree with everything you said. I think the relationships are important, and but it should be an honesty and a transparency to be able to say, I don't know and I don't understand.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to seek out my brother or my sister in that community who can probably speak to it or just help me shed light, and then not be offended, you know, like with this Black Lives Matter movement, or the organization, and people conflate the two. I think it's important that Black Lives Matter as a platform is what it is. It's true, because they do. It's giving attention to this particular group who are saying over a period of time and historically are going through several issues, from police brutality, so forth and so on. And if, as a pastor, you see me with a Black Lives Matter shirt on, okay, I don't want to be perceived as a threat. I don't want to be perceived as less Christian. I don't want to be perceived as some radical who's getting ready to burn a building. Okay, I want to be perceived as someone who lives as a black man, and the reality of a black man who has two African American sons. One who is tall, he has dreadlocks, he drives a car that has tinted windows, but he's the son of a pastor, and he himself is a Christian, and he's a cream puff and wouldn't hurt an officer, and he's a graduate of Chattanooga State who's getting ready to transfer to MTSU. None of what will be visibly known of him,
unless you're in a relationship.
Unless there's a relationship, and so I have to parent a whole different dynamic, and I just need people to not be critical of it, you know, and to rush to judgment when they see Black Lives Matter or an I Can't Breathe shirt. It is not to say, we're anti-white. You know, it is not that. It is giving voice. It is we want to be heard. It is, hey, everybody, we need everybody to look at this issue, right? And so internal looks inside of all of us, and not be necessarily offended, and to not be critical, of those who say Black Lives Matter, and then you come back with Blue Lives Matter. Of course, Blue Lives Matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all officers and cops. I got it. I think there's a respect that we give, but at the same time, is your criticism or your protest of, Black Lives Matter or whatever, whether it's the movement or the organization, is it revealing your own personal sin, your own personal guilt?
Mm-hmm.
And I just think all I'm saying is that, I'm not saying that a person is automatically guilty of racism, whatever, or contributing to the issue, but maybe that ought to be the thing that does make you take a look at you inside of you to say, why am I responding to this like I am? Is it because you see the buildings burning and all of those things where you just have, cast dispersion on that thing because you see pockets of people,
right,
and you see those things, but you don't really see the people who support the movement per se of Black Lives Matter, who's approaching this in a civil way, and who's going and sitting down with the mayors, the police chiefs, the city councilmen, the commission, and so forth and so on, that's trying to really affect change in policy, in a peaceful way. And
I'm going to go back to one other thing, or both. If I were to see, because you and I have had this conversation and a couple times, but if I were to see you with a Black Lives Matter T-shirt, I would ask you, as your friend, Carlos, what do you mean by wearing the shirt? Like, are you, the extreme in the organization? Do you support Planned Parenthood? Do you support the Marxist agenda? Blah blah blah. And I know because you've answered, no. Here's what I mean by this.
Right.
And when we ask those questions, I'm like, oh, I agree with everything you just said, 1,000%. I'm with you.
Yeah, I can be a part of that movement without being a part of the organization.
Absolutely.
And there may be certain tenets of the organization that I totally agree with.
Yes.
Which, if I'm going to be a part of anything, I don't care what it is, I don't care what organization. If there's an organization that I feel conflicts with this, then I'm not in.
You're out.
Right?
Right.
But am I part of the movement? I would say wholeheartedly, yes, I'm a part of the Black Lives Matter movement, because I'm saying Black Lives Matter too. I'm saying that all lives matter, but I'm not going to say all lives matter as some other people are saying all lives matter, because that is to say you have a, because the Black Lives Matter movement has also been accused of being a racist movement within and of itself. Okay, so like we're saying we're anti-white. Well, I don't agree with that.
Yeah. So the conversation that would happen, right, is that if you were to say Black Lives Matter and I were to say all lives matter, the dialogue that's going on, if we're not talking about that, is for you to say, I never said all lives didn't matter.
True.
But Lewis, you've got to, if you don't, that being your gut response to that means that, what I'm trying to say is that all lives aren't being targeted in the same way that we feel like Black lives have been targeted.
I agree.
And so that phrase, from the Christians that I know who are using that phrase, the only thing they mean by that is that we want to put a spotlight on this because this is an area of injustice. The same way is that if there was a movement in this country where there was, and this may get me in trouble, but there was a long, like some black organizations got together and they're like, we're going to kill all white people, and so they just start picking us off, right? Which would just be easy because we don't, most of the time we don't walk around in fear. I would expect my black, and if I were to say, hey, white lives matter, you can't just kill white people, we matter too.
Right. I get it.
That's all that's being said.
I get it. But, and my response would be not to just that, but to the question in general, or to the issue in general. Where, if you say all lives matter, where has been your advocacy for it prior to any of these issues? Or
that's the point.
Prior to the George Floyd issue?
That's the point.
Because look, I mean, the organization of Black Lives Matter happened after the Trayvon Martin thing, right? And then and then it kind of exploded with the Michael Brown thing in
Yep.
Ferguson, Missouri,
Right.
right? And so what happened is, just like in any organization, though, Lewis, you have some radicals that align themselves with the organization that are not what legitimate members of the organization, but align themselves. And you saw the looting, you saw the rioting, you know, just pockets, right? But we're saying, where's been your voice? I mean, where have you been in advocating? Like, I was watching, you know, and I don't want to get political because I don't want, this is not what this is about. But I was looking at, you know, I've been following very closely the police reform debate in the Senate. And when Tim Scott, the senator for South Carolina, got up and they were doing their press conference about the police reform, well, Lindsey Graham comes up and he makes this statement about the Democrats and like, where were y'all? Y'all had the number of years when President Obama was president. Okay, now, I don't know how you may interpret that statement, but I interpret that statement as Lindsey Graham saying, well, even when y'all had a black president, this wasn't addressed. Well, that's not true. This thing has been something that has been debated, but I'm going to say to Lindsey Graham, you've been a representative, you've been a senator for some time now. Why haven't you led the charge? Because there have been incidents after incident. So it's like with people to hear All Lives Matter, we're saying,
Of
you've
course.
been a hypocrite.
Yeah, but
I mean, don't criticize
right.
the Black Lives Matter movement or even organization if you're agreeing as a Christian that all lives do matter. Where's been your advocacy? And if there has been advocacy, because I'm not going to say that there has not been, okay, but I think at some point you're advocating for all lives really kind of need to be seen and tangible in a sense, you know. And I think that if there is an advocacy for all lives, there's no way that you can say you're an advocate for all lives without the attention given to the marginalized.
Yeah, well,
You know, and to the groups that, again, that we're saying are affected in so many ways that some lives are not
seen as valuable because of a whole litany of
I mean,
issues.
just as a black, there's just a whole lot of black problems that white folk don't have.
Yeah, sure.
We all got problems. We just got some different ones, right?
Yeah, and where things, and I am going to end on this, where things, you know, if you think these conversations are hard, where things get really difficult is when you start, and I know we've traveled down some of these roads in various groups, when you start trying to solve issues like education reform or criminal justice reform or whatever, and man, that gets tough because it's tough. But as a church, as churches, we should be able to dig in and at least reflect to the world. And the hope would be that we can, you know, we may not agree on, there's a difference between agreeing on what police reform would look like. But what we shouldn't have to disagree on is that that conversation needs to happen, and we need to get further down the road. Like what policy should be in place. Man, wouldn't it be a great day if that's what we're kind of debating is policy to affect change versus does there need to be change? That'd be a great day.
I just hope and pray that that we can, you know, come together to address these issues. It's a long road. We have a long road ahead, and we won't be able to solve all of them. But if the church can unify, then we can make a statement.
Yep.
We can make a statement.
Yep. All right. Well, we have gone way long. I don't know. We'll see. We may just give out this thing into its entirety. That's probably what we will do. But thank you, Carlos.
Thanks,
I appreciate
Louis.
you.
Appreciate the opportunity,
and I, like I said, I value your friendship way beyond just that you're a black man.
I believe it.
And in spite of the fact that you're a Cowboys fan. So
go Cowboys.
Yes. All right. Well,
Yeah.
God bless you.
Thank you, man.
And
Take care.
thank you for tuning in.